Good evening. Thank you for joining us for another of our Teleworks online lectures. Before we begin, I should like to give you some information about the Atelier at Flowerfield, a 501(c)(3) not-for-profit organization. Our Spring 1 session starts on March 29th and will run for 4 weeks. We offer a selection of fine art, drawing and painting classes in a variety of mediums, both online and in studio. We also offer classes in digital painting, cartooning, and graphic novel design. Details can be found on our website, theatelieratflowerfield.org. Our current art exhibition is called Lockdown and Beyond and will run until May 15th. It's primarily an exhibition of student and teachers' work showing what we've been doing since we were able to open up again. Tonight's lecture is being sponsored by First Republic Private Wealth Management, and the lecture is entitled Moving In, Moving On, Lee Krasner's Work in Jackson Pollock's Studio. And it is being given by Helen Harrison, director of the Krasner Pollock House. We welcome her this evening, and we hope you enjoy tonight's lecture. If you wish to ask questions, please post them in the chat room or the Q&A, and you may also click the raise your hand button, but make sure you keep it raised so we know you're still there. I shall now hand over to Helen Harrison.
Thank you very much, Gabby. I'm very happy to be here. I want to thank Joan Rockwell for inviting me, and also Gabby and Brianna for setting up the Zoom call. I'm going to share my screen. What you're seeing on the screen right now is a view of Lee Krasner in the barn studio at the Pollock-Krasner House in 1962. And what I'm going to do is to give you a little outline of how she navigated the spaces that Pollock used to work in and which she then subsequently took over. On August 15, 1956, the painter Lee Krasner watched stoically as her husband, Jackson Pollock, was buried in Green River Cemetery in Springs, a hamlet in the town of East Hampton, about, I'd say, 70 miles or so from where you are, in flower fields. Several of those who attended the funeral later remarked on how calm and controlled she was, but her outward composure masked the emotional turmoil that she allowed only a few of her close friends to see. Pollock's death in a drunken car crash 4 days earlier was the tragic culmination of their turbulent relationship, which had been strained to the breaking point by his affair with Ruth Kligman, a 26-year-old art student. With her friend, 25-year-old Edith Metzger, who had come out to visit for the weekend, Kligman was a passenger in Pollock's Oldsmobile convertible when it careened off the road, plowed into a stand of trees, and overturned. Kligman was injured, but Pollock and Metzger were killed. When the accident happened, Krasner was in Paris on a trip that allowed her to distance herself from the situation at home, where Pollock's alcoholism was out of control and his infidelity was humiliating to her. Without her steadying influence, however, his downward spiral accelerated until it reached what his biographers, Stephen Nafee and Gregory White Smith, described as escape velocity. On his death, she became the sole heir to the work that remained in his studio, which is a converted storage barn on their property. Pollock had used the building since 1946, when Krasner worked in a small upstairs room in the house, which had previously been his studio. She now had the responsibility of marketing his artistic legacy and of perpetuating his reputation as one of the foremost 20th century abstract painters. Judging by his stature today, more than 60 years after his death, and by the current prices for his work, she succeeded brilliantly on both counts. But Lee Krasner was much more than the formidable widow Pollock of legend, and this wonderful photograph by Robert Mapplethorpe really presents her in that light. But she was also a formidably talented artist who had willingly subjugated her professional ambitions to promote her husband's career. Now that he was gone, she had her own career to think about. When she and Pollock began their relationship in late 1941, Krasner was far better known in the minuscule art world microcosm that was the New York City avant-garde. She lived and worked in an apartment at 51 East 9th Street, around the corner from Pollock's flat at 46 East 8th Street. So she was in this building and Pollock was in this one. In fact, we don't know which floor she was on, but he was on the top floor, as she later described it, a 5 flights up affair. These two windows here and here, these were his studio windows and this was his bedroom. After she moved in with him in 1942, she maintained a separate studio for a time, but later began to use the apartment's back bedroom as a workspace. There's only one known photograph of her in that small room, and this is it. It faced south, not the ideal orientation for a studio. Pollock, by contrast, had the much larger front parlor, ideally lighted by north-facing windows, where he'd been working since he started sharing the apartment with his brother Sanford 10 years earlier. So right from the early days of their relationship, Krasner deferred to Pollock's practical needs, often to the detriment of her own. Now, this was not simply a matter of male dominance and female subjugation. By her own account, following her exposure to Pollock's work, Krasner not only recognized his potential, but also underwent a profound reevaluation of her own artistic direction. As a student of the German emigre teacher and painter Hans Hofmann, she had been traveling the well-worn path of European modernism for some 5 years and was among the leading New York neo-cubists. And in this photograph that was taken in the 9th Street apartment, you can see some examples of the type of still life, still life work she was doing under Hofmann's direction. As such, however, she and her colleagues in the American Abstract Artist Group were considered by the cognoscenti to be in thrall to the School of Paris, followers at best and imitators at worst, certainly not the innovators they aspired to be. Now, when she first saw Pollock's work, and this is an example, when they were invited to be in an exhibition together in late 1941, the show happened in early 42, and it was French and American painters. She looked at the list of names of the people and she recognized some of the people from Paris, like Picasso, Brock, Matisse. That sounded good to her. But then she wanted to know who the Americans were, and she saw that list of names and there was a name on it that she did not recognize, and that was Jackson Pollock. So she went up to his studio. He only lived a block away from her, so she went up to see what his work was like, and she was absolutely stunned. But this is the painting that was in that exhibition of French and American paintings by Pollock. The painting by Krasner that was in that show is no longer in existence. So when she first saw Pollock's work, she said that she felt he was ahead of her. In a 1967 typescript statement, now among the Lee Krasner papers in the Archives of American Art, she described her response to her initial visit to that studio in December 1941. Quote, "What did I think? I was overwhelmed, bowled over, that's all. I saw all those marvelous paintings. I felt as if the floor was sinking when I saw those paintings," unquote. In a 1981 interview with Grace Gluck of the New York Times, she discussed her response in relation to her own development, specifically her acceptance of Hofmann's neo-cubist dicta. She said, "I was much more struck by what he, that is Jackson, was about." This is what she told Gluck. It opened a new channel, a new avenue for me. I started to break away from what I had learned and was involved with. She began, as she put it, to, quote, "lose cubism and absorb Pollock." But she insisted she never, quote, "became a Pollock." I didn't because I wasn't a student of his in that sense. I admired him, but also Mondrian and Matisse. One admires other artists, and I think I'd have admired him whether or not I was his wife. He'd have affected me, unquote. But of course, she was his wife, at first in all but name, and legally as of October 25th, 1945, 2 days shy of her 37th birthday. In the early days of their union, she was constantly confronted by and challenged by his powerfully expressive imagery, which seemed to arise spontaneously from some deep creative wellspring. She tried to tap a similar reservoir within herself, but kept missing the mark. By her own account, she would work on a painting for months at a time, adding layer upon layer until the surface resembled mud. Then, so it would not be a total loss, the frugal Krasner would soak those failed canvases in the bathtub, scrape them down, and give them to Pollock to paint on. But she continued to struggle through what she dubbed her gray slab period. I was putting masses of paint on canvas and nothing would happen, she later recalled. Just tons of paint going nowhere. It was all very frustrating. Ironically, her only surviving canvas from that time bears the name of her former lover, Igor Pantoufov, a painter with whom she lived in the 1930s and who reportedly encouraged her artistic ambitions. Pantoufov, a handsome white Russian emigre whom she met when they were fellow students at the National Academy of Design, was a dashing character, as you can see here, who went on, who went on to specialize in portraiture. Now, I have to tell you that Igor was not exactly a great catch, even though he was dashing. But in later years, he, like Pollock, became an alcoholic, and he also gave up portraiture in favor of painting big-eyed girls a la the Keens. And if you Google him, there's a website devoted to him, and there are people who collect this stuff. Anyway, according to their friend, the artist Fritz Bultmann, he paid great attention to Krasner as an artist. In Nathan Smith's Pollock biography, the authors claim that Krasner virtually stopped painting while she lived with Pantoufov from 1932 through 1939, yet some 100 of her works from that period, 1/6 of her entire known oeuvre, have survived. After leaving the academy, she continued to take classes at Greenwich House, a settlement house on the Lower East Side, and was employed on the New Deal art projects from 1934 on, primarily on the WPA Federal Art Projects Mural Division. And although I'm not really certain about this, I think this may very well be Lee working on another person's mural. Apparently she was a very good technician, and she would often be called upon to assist with the master muralist's work and really hope to get a mural of her own, although that didn't actually work out. But it was Pantoufov who, in a brief flirtation with modernism, first enrolled in Hans Hofmann's school. And he probably suggested to Krasner that she also attend, which she did from 1937 to 1940. In June 1944, Krasner temporarily moved her studio from Pollock's back room to a spare room in the apartment of a friend and fellow artist, Reuben Kadish, who believed that she and Pollock were getting on each other's nerves. They were so competitive that they couldn't even work in the same house together, Kadish told Pollock's biographers, Nathan Smith. Whether or not having adjoining studios troubled Pollock, it evidently bothered Krasner. According to Kadish, she was being digested into oblivion by his presence. Again, only one canvas from that period has survived, and it shows her returning to the cubist structure she learned from Hofmann, albeit overlaid with expressionistic brushwork. And you can see how this compositionally is very similar to those very hard-edged neo-cubist work she was doing in the 30s. However much conflict Krasner was experiencing creatively, she continued to promote Pollock's nascent career. By this time, he had been taken up by Peggy Guggenheim, a niece of Solomon R. Guggenheim, whom the war had forced to return to her native New York City after many years as an expatriate in Europe, where she collected surrealist and abstract art and fraternized with the avant-garde. In 1942, she opened a gallery on 57th Street, Art of This Century, where she showcased her collection and exhibited work by young unknown Americans. And here is Peggy right here. And here is Frederick Kiesler, the architect who designed this rather eccentric interior of the gallery. Encouraged by trusted advisors like Marcel Duchamp, Pete Mondrian, and James Johnson Sweeney of the Museum of Modern Art, Guggenheim took Pollock on as her protege. She paid him a monthly stipend, commissioned a mural from him. And by the way, this mural, which lives at the University of Iowa in their art museum, which is being rebuilt, is currently on view at the Guggenheim Museum in New York. And it will be there through, I think, mid-September. So you will have an opportunity to see it if you get a chance to go into the city before it closes in September. So that's the mural behind them. And she also gave him his first solo exhibition in the winter of 1943. Guggenheim was well aware that Krasner was also an artist, having seen some of her paintings when she mistakenly entered her studio on her visit to see Pollock's work for the first time. In 1945, Guggenheim invited Krasner to participate in a group exhibition, The Women. But though Krasner's name is listed on the announcement, she did not submit a piece to the show, perhaps because of her reluctance to be pigeonholed in an all-female context. She did participate in other group shows in the 40s, including abstract and surrealist art in America at the Mortimer Brandt Gallery in Manhattan. Organized by Sidney Janis, who wrote the book of the same title in which Krasner's painting Composition was illustrated, the show went on a national tour in 1944. The following year, she was included in A Problem for Critics at Gallery 67 in Manhattan, where she was the only female artist among a roster of notable European and American modernists, including Pollock, Rothko, Picasso, and Miro. Whatever competitive pressure Krasner may have felt in the privacy of their adjacent studios, in public, she was Pollock's ardent champion. Clement Greenberg, the critic, recalled that when she introduced him to Pollock, a virtual unknown when they met in late 1942 or early 1943, Lee declared, "This guy is a great painter." The writer Lionel Abel, a friend from those years, summed up the opinion of many observers, quote, "She, that is Krasner, carried the ball for the enterprise. She thought the whole thing out from the beginning, how to put him over and make him a big success," unquote. It was Krasner's idea to move to the country in 1945 when Pollock's drinking and erratic behavior were threatening to derail the career she had cultivated with such determination for nearly 4 years. At first he resisted, but soon saw the wisdom of distancing himself from the city's plentiful temptations and distractions. They moved to a homestead in Springs in early November, renting at first while Krasner negotiated a loan from Guggenheim that would enable them to buy the property and settle down. By then they were married, and for the only time in their 15-year relationship, Pollock's studio arrangements were less comfortable than Krasner's. Since she apparently was never asked about it, nor did she volunteer the information, we can only speculate that her newfound domestic security prompted her to assert herself. She appropriated the back parlor, the biggest room in the house, with a bay window. Now here you see it almost 20 years later, almost 30 years later. But if you see right here in the chimney, there's a circular patch. There was a Franklin stove that came down and sat right here. And here's the bay window with the abundant south-facing light. But this clearly was the warmest spot in the house. And in addition to the abundant sunlight, the room was warmed by that Franklin stove, which together with a kitchen range was the building's only heat source. Pollock set up shop in a chilly upstairs room, the smallest of the 3 bedrooms on that floor, although it had the advantage of a north window. It also had privacy, which Krasner's workplace didn't, but compared to hers, it was cramped and Spartan. Perhaps to compensate for the lack of heat, both painters experienced a burst of creative energy. Krasner emerged from her gray slab period with lively abstractions rendered in exuberant strokes of color, while Pollock began his Accabonac Creek series, infusing his cryptic imagery with a new brightness and openness. By the spring, when Guggenheim's loan enabled them to get a mortgage, they took title to the property and Pollock began cleaning out the barn that became his studio. It was ready by the fall when he was already at work on his Sounds in the Grass series of all-over abstractions. He showed 16 works from both series at Art of this Century the following January. Krasner completed only 6 paintings during that same period, but she was a slow worker who constantly revised. And she was juggling her studio time with domestic chores, which were arduous in a house with no indoor plumbing or central heating. Years later, when asked what it was like at first, Krasner replied, "How can I describe it? It was hell, to put it mildly, for me." In a more positive mood, however, she described their early days of country living as all a beautiful new experience. Notwithstanding the hardships, she had found a new and fruitful direction in her work that would carry her through the rest of the decade. Now, I just realized that I am not, in fact, Gabrielle. I am actually Helen Harrison. Now, once the barn was cleaned out and converted to serve as Pollock's studio, Krasner moved into his former studio upstairs in the house, where she worked for about 10 years. In that small room, roughly 10 by 14 feet, she developed, let's go to the next one. She developed a little image series of grid-based paintings, executed in a heavily layered impasto and sometimes embellished with calligraphic pourings of liquid paint, as you see here. Meanwhile, Pollock was rapidly progressing with the all-over poured paintings that made him famous. Both artists were moving into uncharted territory and often sought mutual reassurance, although, according to Krasner, they only visited each other's studios by invitation. Occasionally during this period, however much they valued their privacy, necessity caused their working and living spaces to overlap. In a 1976 interview with the art historian Barbara Rose, Krasner mentioned that when it was too cold to paint in the unheated upstairs studio, she would come down and work in the back parlor. The barn studio was also unheated, and although, according to Krasner, Pollock would manage in winter if he wanted to, he would get dressed up, as she put it, in an outfit the like of which you've never seen. He worked in the house when the barn got too cold. At least one of his large canvases, this one, and probably other smaller ones, as well as works on paper, were done near the warmth of the parlor stove. If this overlap caused any professional tension between Pollock and Krasner, it is not recorded. The awkwardness of the situation may have been eased by Pollock's brief period of sobriety from late 1948 through 1950, during which time he was taking tranquilizers. Again, it's speculation, but possibly his newfound equilibrium made it easier for Krasner to tolerate underfoot. What we do know is that after central heating was installed in the house in late 1949, she worked exclusively in the upstairs studio, which Pollock entered by invitation only. Now you can see right over here, see the radiator under the window? That shows you that this was after the heating had been installed. And she equally respected Pollock's privacy. Her statements often refer to the arrangement whereby each would ask the other for assessments of work in progress. And this is actually the only known photograph that we have showing the two of them examining one of her works, not in the studio, but in the bedroom. She described the procedure to an interviewer, Emily Wasserman, in 1968. Quote, "Generally, I would preface it with a big bellyache about something, and then I'd list what was bothering me. And when he'd come to the studio, he'd say something like, 'Oh, forget all that and just keep painting. It's a lot of rot,' unquote." For his part, Pollock greatly valued his wife's opinion. As she told Wasserman, he did keep saying, "Come and look, what do you think?" I mean, that was a constant. So I take it that some part of my response was essential, you know? Whatever the other elements of their relationship may have been, their respect for each other's artistic integrity was surely an important, not to say a crucial component. This mutual sustenance, however, was nurtured and expressed in private. To the world at large, Krasner did not have a career in the professional sense of that term. Representation by a dealer who cultivated clients for the work and who mounted annual solo shows that were reviewed in the press. But she did exhibit her work regularly, both in New York City and locally on Eastern Long Island. Two of her paintings and a mosaic table she had made out of, you can see it's a wagon wheel rim. That's what this is. It's an iron rim of a wagon wheel. And they had a local metal worker forge some legs for it. That was featured in an exhibition called The Modern House Comes Alive at the Bertha Schaefer Gallery in 1948, when she and Pollock were both included in the annual invitational exhibition at Guildhall in East Hampton. Her painting won second prize, while Pollock's came in third. Her prize-winning painting may have been this untitled oil on pressed wood, which is inscribed on the stretcher, Lee Krasner, East Hampton, $350. I'll take it at $500. The Modern House exhibition reviews were the only ones in which her work was mentioned. Several publications reviewed it favorably. Writing in the New York Herald Tribune, Anne Pringle described the mosaic table as magnificent. In 1949, she and Pollock showed together in Man and Wife, a group exhibition at the Sidney Janis Gallery in Manhattan, and again at Guildhall in 1950. The following year, they were both included in the so-called 9th Street Show, a group exhibition that helped establish the roster of the New York School. And here you can see how she spelled her name with two S's. She later dropped that second S, but there she is, and there is Pollock spelled correctly on the poster. Also in 1951, after Pollock interceded on her behalf, she had the first solo exhibition of her career at the Betty Parsons Gallery in Manhattan, where he had been represented since Peggy Guggenheim closed her gallery and moved to Venice in 1947. This is one of only two paintings that survived from that exhibition. All the others were later reworked, and you can see the size of it. It's over 10 feet wide. So this is a very ambitious canvas done in that tiny little 10 by 14 studio. It's quite remarkable. Indeed, ever since Guggenheim gave him his first solo exhibition in 1943, Pollock had had an annual solo show in New York City every year. Guggenheim had also exposed his work in Venice, and it was being included in important shows across the United States and in Europe. A profile in Life magazine's August 8, 1949 issue broadcast his name to more than 5 million readers. By comparison, Krasner was virtually unknown, although as her exhibition history indicates, she was hardly invisible. But she had yet to achieve much recognition. Although a few critics wrote favorably about her 1951 Betty Parsons show, there were no sales. It was 4 years before she had another solo show in New York City. By early 1950, Krasner evidently decided that she had outgrown the bedroom studio. Notwithstanding professional setbacks and whatever reticence she felt about competing with Pollock, she also wanted a detached workspace. In 1953, they bought an acre of land adjacent to their property and moved a small 19th century barn onto it, with the intention of turning it into Krasner's studio. Although this never became her primary workplace, especially as it had a dirt floor, no heat, and no electricity, her decision to establish a separate studio shows that she remained dedicated to her work in spite of her lack of professional validation, as indicated by sales. Edward F. Dragon, that's the gentleman on the left here, and his companion, Alfonso Osorio, a personal friend who was also an artist and a collector, acquired 2 of her works, but whether they were purchases or gifts is not clear. They were included in a selection from 12 East Hampton collections at Guildhall in 1953. The following summer, Krasner had a 1-day solo exhibition at the House of Books and Music in East Hampton. This was in a carport that was actually just covered, more or less an outdoor show just for 1 day. And the joke was that no one was smart enough to steal one. And again, nothing was sold, much less stolen. From 1945 to 1955, when she exhibited her collage paintings at the Stable Gallery in Manhattan, Krasner's work underwent 5 distinct changes in directions, or breaks, as she called them. You can see 3 of them represented here. The first was she abandoned the gestural exuberance inspired by her initial encounter with Pollock's work for the thick paint and grid-like structure of the little image paintings. So that series she worked on for about 5 years. Then she made a series of geometric abstractions, like the one you saw her and Pollock admiring in the bedroom. And that quickly gave way to a few transitional expressionistic figure-based canvases, later including her so-called personage paintings, all of which were later reworked. And that led to the abstract color field paintings that she showed at the Betty Parsons Gallery. And this is the other of the 2 surviving canvases from that show. Most of them later served as the basis for a series of abstract collage paintings, which she began in 1953. These abrupt directional shifts bespeak an aesthetic restlessness, dissatisfaction, or perhaps a lack of confidence that plagued her throughout her relationship with Pollock. By the end of that relationship, Krasner had made yet another transition, abandoning the collage technique for a return to straight painting and the exuberant brushwork and florid forms of her earlier expressionist phase. But the subject matter was figurative and much more ominous, perhaps in response to her deteriorating marriage. And I want to point out this painting in particular has real significance in her oeuvre, not only as a turning point stylistically, but also because of the subject. You can see it's kind of a bloated figure, and with its feet here and some sort of excrescence here, and a head wound, and an evil eye up in the right-hand corner. This is at a time when Pollock was drinking heavily. He had gained a lot of weight. And when he was killed in the automobile accident, what killed him was in fact a head wound. And although she painted this painting before his death and really had to confront it when she returned to the studio after he died, she said the painting frightened her. And as you can see, it was, it was later titled Prophecy. Now, in spite of having produced and exhibited a solid body of work in the collage paintings, She had yet to receive much critical recognition, much less make a sale. Working in such emotional and professional turmoil, is it any wonder that the images in her 1956 paintings seem almost to be devouring themselves? Following Pollock's death, Krasner faced her greatest challenge, managing his estate and her own career simultaneously. After spending the winter in New York City, she returned to Long Island in the spring and began to make the transition from the upstairs studio in the house to Pollock's barn studio. To my knowledge, she never spoke directly on the record about that transition, except to say that it was a hard time for her. One can only imagine the emotional toll it took to empty the space of his work, which bore the indelible stamp of his personality, to tack a blank canvas on the wall, against which his canvases had formerly been stacked, and to wait for something to, as she put it, suggest itself. What did suggest itself is utterly remarkable. Remember that this was a woman in deep mourning. Friends describe her as being devastated by Pollock's death, beset by guilt, anger, and sorrow. Wouldn't those feelings, so evident to those who knew her, be expected to manifest themselves in her work? What did emerge out of the emotional wellspring she had been trying to tap since her first encounter with Pollock's work was an explosion of voluptuous organic imagery rendered in lively brushwork and bright color, exactly the opposite of what might have been anticipated. Years later, when the poet Richard Howard questioned her about this seeming contradiction, she was at a loss to explain it. I remember she said that when I was painting Listen, that's this canvas, which is so highly keyed in color, I've seen it many times since, and it looks like such a happy painting. I can remember that while I was painting it, I almost didn't see it because tears were literally pouring down, unquote. If this was not a joyous time for Krasner, it was a period of great achievement, when what came to be known as her Earth Green series asserted her artistic independence. This is the masterpiece of that series from the Whitney Museum, and as you can see, they turned it into a scarf. Her response to speculation about her motivations was often an evasive, non-committal, I wouldn't know, or I couldn't say. In this case, however, it seems apparent that she was genuinely perplexed by the upbeat turn her work had taken in the face of her grief. Pollock's first biographer, B.H. Friedman, a close friend during that time, considered it to have been a kind of antidote to her negative feelings, as well as an assertion of her determination to move forward with her life and career. Whatever the cause, the effect was to liberate the creative energy that had been suppressed while she concentrated on managing Pollock. Moreover, instead of a tiny room, she now had a spacious studio with a high ceiling and 21-foot walls, and she made the most of it, enlarging both her format and her gesture. Krasner lived for 28 years after Pollock's death, dividing her time between New York City and Springs, where she used his former barn studio until severe arthritis and other health problems ended her productivity. Morning Glory, the last painting she's known to have done there, was completed in the summer of 1982. That December, she was photographed in her Manhattan studio, the converted master bedroom in her East 79th Street apartment, in front of what is believed to be her final work, a collage painting that illustrates her lifelong penchant for revising and recycling earlier material. It's made of drawings done in Hoffman School in the late 1930s, and here you see some of the fragments of those figure studies. And those were cut up and collaged onto one of the few 1951 color field abstractions that she hadn't already reworked. And then she added new areas of paint to unify the composition. This poignant final statement shows that for Lee Krasner, moving on often involved a paradoxical dialogue with the past. Thank you very much for your attention, and I would be very happy to answer any questions that you may have.
Right, let's see. I think we do have three questions in the chat room, so let's go to that. This is from, oh, let's see, where are we? Danny Baker says, bravo, thank you. The others, I think, had problems getting on. Is there anyone else who'd like to ask any questions? You know, we have about another half an hour we can go for that. John Klein, okay, hold on, let me see. Okay, John Klein. Okay, I'm going to allow you to talk. Okay, John, take it away. Can you hear us? Hello? Okay, I'm going to ask you to unmute if you'd like to ask your question. I'm not able to get hold of him. Okay, Barbara Stone, I'm going to allow you to talk. All right, wait a minute, let me see if we can get this again. John, are you there? Can you hear us? I think, unfortunately, they still have their volume muted. Okay, I'm going to see if we have another chat. Okay, Danny Baker, has Helen read the book 9th Street Women? Any thoughts on the book and the part on Lee?
Well, not only have I read it, but the author came and did research at the house. So she used our oral history collection quite significantly because we actually have the artist's voices on record. So that was extremely helpful to Mary Gabriel. I think she did a remarkable job of synthesizing the stories of those 5 women and putting them into the social and political context of the period. And although it is, you know, quite an extensive read, you will definitely get a lot of wonderful information from it.
Thank you. Okay, I have 2 questions from Vivian Papa. First one is, how did Stony Brook University get involved with the property?
Stony Brook's actually inherited the property from Lee Krasner's estate. It was given to them by her estate. She didn't leave it to any specific organization, but any nonprofit that was willing to take it on and run it as what she described as a quote unquote public museum and library was entitled to have it. And Stony Brook Foundation, which is the private nonprofit affiliate of Stony Brook University, stepped up and took it and opened it as a museum in June of 1988.
Okay, does anyone else have any other questions? I'm afraid we weren't able to get hold of the people who raised their hand. You do need to unmute in order to be able to talk. Perhaps you could put your questions in the Q&A and then we could answer them, or you can put them in the chat room. Let's see, we have, okay, well, Danny Baker says, so cool, thank you, great presentation, thanks. Do we have any other questions? Does anyone else want to say anything? Okay.
I have a question.
Sure.
Can you hear me?
Yes,
Yeah,
yes.
Oh, good. I once read that Lee Krasner, I think she grew up in Brooklyn in a very traditional Jewish family. And I had read, I think that her sister's husband had died and the family expected Lee to marry her brother-in-law.
Mm-hmm.
Is there any truth to that story?
Yes, it is. She was the next in line, and she had no intention of becoming a housewife. So her younger sister, the youngest of the 6, Ruth, married him. That was Bill Stein. So she married Bill Stein and had a child, Ronald Stein, with him. There were already 2 girls from the first marriage, and so there were 3 children of William Stein, were her nieces and 2 nieces and a nephew.
Yeah, thanks. I had read that, and I think I read a biography about
Yeah,
her
if you read
years ago.
Gail
And
Levin's biography, an excellent, excellent treatment of Lee's life.
yeah,
You're
yeah, thank you.
welcome.
John, I think we have you unmuted. Would you like to ask your question? Hello, John Klein? No, I don't seem to be able to get him. Let's see.
I can't hear.
No, I can't get him either. Okay. Is there anyone else who'd like to ask a question? Let's see. What have we got here? No, we just have, people saying thank you. Joan says wonderful, thank you. Any other questions from anybody? Give it a minute.
Well, I would like to mention that anyone who'd like to come and visit the Pollock House and see Lee's studios, the upstairs bedroom and the barn studio, which Pollock also used, but we won't go into that. They're welcome to come after May 1st when we reopen for the season by reservation. So we still have COVID restrictions. So if you go on our website, pkhouse.org, and click on visiting us, you can make a reservation for a guided tour. And if you would like, for an extra $10, you can take a virtual reality tour, which will take you back into the studio as it looked in the 1940s and early 50s when Pollock was using it. You'll see his work reappear in the building and hear him talk about it. And then it will change to the 1960s as it looked when Lee was working in it. And some of her work will return and she will discuss it. And it's an immersive experience. You wear a headset and you feel like you are actually in the space. It's really quite remarkable. And it's a way of bringing the work into the workspace because we don't own any of their artwork. We only own the property where they lived, their personal possessions, everything that was in the property at the time of Lee's death in 1984. So if you want to go back to the studio as it was when they were working in it, you take the virtual reality tour.
Thank you. Does anyone else have any other questions? Anything about that or anything else relating to the lecture? Give it a minute or so, and then I think we'll wrap it up. Okay, I think that's probably it. So we would like to thank Helen Harrison for giving us such an interesting lecture. We hope you found it both interesting and informative. We'd also like to thank First Republic Private Wealth Management for their generous sponsorship of tonight's program. And I'd just like to let you know what's coming up next. So the next event will be a lecture demonstration by one of our instructors, James Beale. So he will be demonstrating the work of Cy Mead, who had considerable influence on James's work, and he will be talking about this. So that is on March 25th. Same time, it'll be 7 o'clock. There will be an email going out about it. And then on April 15th, Helen Harrison will be coming back to to give us a talk on Jackson Pollock's creative imagination. So that will be on April 15th at 7 p.m. We will be sending out emails about both of those events. And please feel free to check us out on the atelier@flowerfield.org. We do post our lectures on our website. So if you've missed anything, you're welcome to go and see it again. It usually takes us a few days to get it up on the website, but it should be there hopefully by the end of next week, if not before. Thank you very much. Thank you, Helen, and good night, everyone.